From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Glynn Tonsor on the cattle markets. In addition to sizing up the latest price action, Glynn will share the latest data from his National Meat Demand Monitor. Those new numbers bode well for the beef industry. Then for you, the first of this week's features on the 6 Kansas couples who will be honored as Kansas Master Farmers, Master Farm Homemakers in ceremonies at the Kansas State Fair next week. Today you'll hear about Keith and Marsha Doane of Osborne County. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee discusses the ongoing concern over flying wildlife collisions with wind turbines and an enlightening new study on mitigating that. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today. Good to have you aboard once again for another Agriculture Today. Well, because we were away yesterday, we held over our cattle market segment to today, of course. And doing the honors this time around, livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, K-State Research and Extension, with a grab bag of things we'll take up today, Glynn, starting with the usual recap of the markets last week. A lower tone to it, maybe the exception being the fed cattle market, which held its own.
Yeah, as lower tone, I think there's several reasons. Yes, we're going into a holiday weekend, so the market hit pause there. There's some aftermath from Ida as it relates to infrastructure we'll talk about, even some shocks in the global marketplace, China and Brazil and so forth. So there's a lot of things hitting the market. We'll break those down. Let's just do the numbers real quick. Mm-hmm. So AMS called fed cattle on Friday about 125 flat for the week in the cash market. That differs notably from the board. So the October live cattle contract was down about $4 for the week, below 125. For several weeks, the board has been leading cash to be determined if that resumes or not, but that certainly wasn't the case this past week. We look over to feeders, sticking with the board initially here. September feeder cattle, 158 and change, down a full $6 for the week. Again, some bearish tones there. AMS called the Pratt, Kansas market mixed depending on weight class, and this is where the corn market shows up. Mm-hmm. So I'll quote two different lots. So 219 head, weighing 641 pounds, came at 177. Notably higher than a heavier lot. So 342 head, weighing 780, came in at 158. On balance, when you look across the USDA report, again, this is for Pratt, I'd say the cattle that were over 700 pounds were down fairly hard, $4 to $8 is the note I made here for this discussion. But the cattle that were under 700 pounds were actually up $6, maybe even $7. I think that's reflecting corn came down. So the price weight slide changing on feeder cattle. So one of the shocks that hit this past week was the corn market's down. Well, there's lots of discussion about how much corn is going to be in South America, but I think in the near term, something that's relevant is I'll call them mixed stories because it's hard to sort through the chatter, is the aftermath of Ida and what it does to the ability to export things through the New Orleans port. Most of our listeners know the lion's share of the grain in this country goes down the Mississippi River and out. More meat than is recognized. It goes that way as well. Not all, but certainly that's important. So infrastructure comes up again. There's a lot of political chatter around infrastructure. Is why I'm bringing it up. Is ag is beholden to infrastructure. In this case, train and water infrastructure in particular. And I think that showed up in the market this week. So corn first, with some spillover on beef exports potentially hitting. I'll call it a pause because of a challenge getting it out of America.
And to round out the story from last week on the beef cutout, well, there was some slippage there as well?
Yeah, and I think it's from similar forces we just talked about. Mm-hmm. But the choice cutout was $338 on Friday, down about $7 from the week before, and select was $306, down more like $10. Not only those factors that I just mentioned, they show up there as well. There's the uncertainty on Delta variant, which I'm going to come to in a moment. I think there's some reason to be optimistic, but uncertainty there. And we have to wait and see what the post-Labor Day buying is. There's a lot before. I think the beef market took a pause for several, wholesale beef market that is, and that's why both Choice and Select were off this past week.
As far as slaughter pace, which you've been keeping tabs on ever since the pandemic, but once more a pare back in volume?
There was, and I hope it's a temporary warning sign, but there was a pare back. So the initial estimates, and again, USDA gives us the final ones 2 weeks later, the initial through Saturday was 624,000 head, which would be down notably from 651 the week before. That is, I'd call it a disappointing volume. There's been a lot of chatter in the industry about the quote-unquote leverage swinging towards feedlots away from packers as we got more current with animals. This past week, that statement would not hold, is why that's disappointing from a cattle seller's perspective. If you combine that with the transport issues, as well as, and we're going to talk about this, the BSE announcement in Brazil, I think all of that added up to a bearish tone in many places. It's actually quite surprising. Cash-fed cattle held flat, for those that followed the numbers earlier, while everything else on balance was down this past week.
Our listeners will remember that you do maintain that meat demand monitor every month. And have you anything new on that front?
Yeah, and I call the data the way it is, but there's some optimistic points in this. So the August meat demand monitor, which again is beef and pork checkoff supported here at K-State, has some good data comparing August with July on two fronts. One is just outright demand. So we monitor retail, think grocery store, at-home consumption, as well as food service or restaurant away from home demand for beef and pork products. And across the board, August demand per those measures was up from July. That is good in itself. But what's really important, I think, is to go further. One of the things we do in that meat demand monitor is we ask folks where they had a meal yesterday, and separately we do it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And because of that, I have an ongoing metric kind of by the day, and I'm quoting here month to month, of the prevalence of at-home versus away from home, and to be complete here, even skipped meals. And what I really want to drive home is there's not evidence yet in August compared to July that we have more people eating meals at home. Why am I highlighting that? There's been concern on the Delta variant. How much would foot traffic slow? Would people, just how much larger of a at-home working pattern is there? And per this estimate, there's not a big change. So this report's going to be posted this week. USDA signed off on it over Labor Day weekend. Folks can bring that up. But the positive comments there would be is just outright demand measures were up, as well as our metric of foot traffic, for those that are following me, away from home versus at home, doesn't show that Delta variant, this is national comment here, has had a big impact. Certainly regionally it's going to show up. Certain states have had bigger challenges with the Delta than others, even back to the hurricane, right? If we're talking, the Louisiana, Mississippi, even parts of Texas pocket, certainly restaurant traffic's not the same where the hurricane hit. But nationally, that is all supportive of beef demand, and I hope we see that in the months ahead.
Time will tell. On the international front, something arose that caught everybody's attention. There were confirmed cases of BSE in Brazil, and one of the major export markets for beef, China, has suspended its business with that country.
Yes, so I want to be careful not to step out of my wheelhouse here because I'm not this scientist, but this is labeled a atypical, or even more nearly 2 atypical cases of BSE. From my understanding, that's really important because there's not a human health risk associated with this. Mm-hmm. As one that wants us to follow the science the best we can, that is important to note. But you're exactly right. Here in the near term, China has suspended its imports from Brazil. That's very important for lots of reasons. One is Brazil is a major protein exporter. It's a powerhouse that the U.S. competes with in several ways, not just with beef, by the way, but across the board on all proteins. And China, of course, is a major importer of all things in the ag commodity space that we're aware of. So monitoring that directly is very relevant. Exactly where those Brazilian products might be displaced versus just stay in their own domestic market will be really important. Monitoring if and where China goes to find alternative beef in the near term will be very important. Those are pretty obvious, and I didn't tell anything that was, news-shattering to any of our listeners. But I want to drive this point even further is, every day that goes by, even with COVID, hopefully in the rearview mirror one of these days, we live in a very globally connected world. So what goes on in Brazil versus China has a bigger impact in Kansas than it did 3 years ago, and certainly than it did 33 years ago. To drive that one even further, there's a lot of chatter the last few weeks about African swine fever now in our hemisphere. I certainly hope and pray we don't see that here in the U.S. We need to monitor that, though, because even if you are a feed yard operator here in Kansas, the development of ASF further in this hemisphere would be very important, even though it's quote-unquote not your industry. At the end of the day, you're part of a broader protein, globally connected sector. So I threw a lot of information at us there, but I hope that the China-Brazil relationship sticks to monitoring the science. I hope we see proper coverage of that. So I inserted the atypical case because I think it's a little bit less inflammatory, and I hope we see that in the days ahead as well. As
far as the U.S. intervening and hiking its exports to China, though, that's still a wild card?
I think that's possible. We need to remember that there was some of that already occurring, so the U.S. was already gaining on that front. But the U.S. and Brazil are not the only sources of beef, and they're very different types of beef, by the way. The U.S. and Canada have much more similar types of beef that's being exported than, say, Brazil versus the U.S. That's that term called comparative advantage. I've belabored in other interviews and full talks, and that's okay. Not all beef's equal is the point. With that's different price points and different cuts and so forth. I don't think that China will just default to try to get every pound it was getting from Brazil from the U.S. because it's not the same product is why I say that. But nonetheless, there could certainly be a short-term positive benefit to the U.S. from that if nothing else changes. What I'm trying to highlight here is it's very globally connected. It's very likely we'll just have some moving dominoes where China will get more from other countries and maybe the U.S. will backfill on those and so forth. I hope there's not a overreaction that's not scientifically informed is really what I'm trying to drive home today.
Keep all the facts on the table is the message there. Yeah. You will be talking Outlook, of course, well, at a couple of venues upcoming, both sponsored by K-State. One is the Ag Lenders Conference your department hosts in the latter part of the month, and the other is that Beef Stocker Field Day, Glynn.
Yeah, so the first one, the Ag Lenders meeting, is traditionally in Garden City, followed by here in Manhattan, September 28th, 29th. I'm slated to give a focused demand talk. So listeners here are used to hearing me put some nuggets on demand, but you'll get a full 30-minute version of it from me at that meeting. All the wealth in this industry starts with consumers. So understanding beef demand is of paramount. It is truly essential, to use that term. It's been overused and misused a lot in the last 18 months. It truly is essential for the industry. Meanwhile, for the Stocker Field Day, I'm slated and looking forward to giving a full outlook talk there. I always look forward to that event. K-State can showcase its comparative advantage in the stocker space. Not many other land-grant universities have the focus on the stocker sector like K-State does. If you are part of the stocker industry, I encourage you to come to that. If you're part of the ag lending finance community, I encourage you to come to either Garden City or Manhattan event, whichever is closest to your operation.
The Ag Lenders Conferences, September the 28th and 29th, Garden City and Manhattan, respectively, as Glynn says, the Beef Stocker Field Day on September the 30th. Glynn, thanks, and we will see you at both of those events.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
Glynn Tonsor with this week's Cattle Market Commentary. He's a livestock economist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more for you. This is Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and now for you the first of several segments this week that are, frankly, a tad overdue. The 2020 class of Kansas Master Farmers, Master Farm Homemakers will be formally inducted a week from today in ceremonies at the Kansas State Fair. Normally, this event would have taken place last March, but was pushed back a few months by the pandemic. To remind, this recognition program is in its 94th year now. K-State Research and Extension was and remains an original sponsor in partnership now with Kansas Farmer Magazine. 6 standout farm and ranch couples are selected for this honor each year based on their leadership in agriculture, environmental stewardship, and service to their communities. We've for you this week conversations with each of the 6 couples, beginning right here today. Doane Family Farms is every bit that. The Doane family tree has been prominent in Osborne County agriculture for many, many decades. The oldest of 4 boys, Keith, took up farming for good with his father in 1961, on the very place that he and Marsha continue to operate today, a few miles outside the city of Downs. Marsha was also raised on a farm near Alton. Together, Keith and Marsha raised 4 sons of their own, 2 of which are now farming with them, another involved part-time. Currently, the Doanes operate 7,700 acres of cropland, growing wheat, corn, sorghum, soybeans, and alfalfa, also 3,000 acres of pasture, on which they run 250 cow-calf pairs and 10 bulls. In addition to their agricultural pursuits, the entire family is deeply involved in local church and community service.
I grew up with 3 other brothers, so there's 4 of us. And we grew up on the farm, and we would have been 4th generation of Doanes that farmed in Osborne County. We all live within 11 miles of where we grew up, and we all farm.
Were you destined to farm? Was that what you were thinking as you were growing up?
Well,
this is my calling?
I always enjoyed farming. As a young kid growing up, I run a tractor and helped with cattle work, and I like to work on machinery, and I even had a chance to drive a team a couple times when I was young, because we had a neighbor that had a team of horses and a team of mules, and I got to drive them on a couple different occasions, once raking hay with a team of horses and once cultivating with all four of them. So my time in agriculture goes back far enough that I can really think about a lot of changes in it.
Marsha, did you grow up on a farm as well?
Yes, I did. I grew up on a farm. We had a pretty small farm, but we raised hogs, and so I got the job of taking care of hogs and milked a few cows and cut some wheat. So I knew farm life.
You originally were studying to develop a career in education, though?
Yes, I graduated from Fort Hays State with a degree in elementary ed, and I taught 1 year. I had a long career, 1 year, before we were married, and I tried substituting the first year we were married, but that didn't go so well. So then we had kids, and so it was kind of hard to find babysitter at 7:30 in the morning. So I just decided that I needed to stay home, raise the kids.
And you were an active participant in the farm as well.
Yes, I think I am.
Very much so. Very much so.
Keith, how did you grow the place, and what was the game plan?
As far as the game plan, there was probably no game plan, actually. I probably lived pretty much day to day and responded to things that had come along and tried to do the right thing when we had a chance, and so we gave our kids a chance to farm. Her dad had access to some ground that he didn't want to farm, and we was able to rent that, and our boys were getting old enough. They'd spend a lot of time running tractors and doing stuff like that, so they were capable of operating the ground with our help, and we had a plan that made it so they paid for seed and fertilizer and did a lot of the work on the ground, and we did the rest of it. They earned money to go to college on this ground, and they all, I think, while doing that, developed a respect for what could happen in farming if you put your mind to it, And so we got the second one and the last one. Rodney and Craig are both full-time actively farming. Craig lives a mile north from here, and Rodney lives about 21 miles west of here, between Alton and Cedar, out in that country. I think another thing that we got to really be thankful for is that we had good support, not monetary support, but good support from her folks and my grandparents and people like that. And then we are people of faith. We go to church. We try to teach our kids to have good ethics and be morally responsible, and we just believe that taking those principles and applying to our farming allows us to rent ground and be successful farming. And so we hope our grandkids and kids and grandkids always continue to do that.
Marsha, you are certainly devoted to the church activity. In fact, as we sit, your church is within 200 yards of this very place.
Yes.
So it's not only handy, but it's a part of your lives. And the two of you have also engaged in any number of civic activities beyond church, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, we have.
I was involved in Extension. I was on the board for a number of years, and I was also on the board when we became a district. And I enjoyed that time and getting to know people from other counties after we got the district. And when we first got married, you can get involved in lots and lots of things, but we felt like we needed to have some family time, and so we each decided we're going to be in one thing other than our church, because we wanted to devote most of our time to the church. And so we've kind of kept that philosophy down through the years, and then when you have 4 boys and they play baseball in the summer, one year we had 4 on 4 different teams. So the car was loaded, lunches packed, and I didn't make all the games, but I tried. That kept us pretty busy.
Keith, back to the operation. One
Yes.
of the things that the both of you are very committed to as you go about your day-to-day operation is conservation.
Yes. Yeah, and when I was a young man, I don't know if it was before we was married, I think it would have been before we was married, I went to an extension meeting someplace, and there was this speaker talking about the importance of soil conservation, and he talked about some countries in either the Mediterranean or the Baltic area that just didn't have enough topsoil left to raise crops to feed their family. And, I just kind of put a spot in my mind that says, I want to be conservation minded, and when I get done farming, I want my land to be a place where you can raise food for the next generation. And so my granddad sold me 80 acres of ground, and he didn't really want me to, but I had terraces built on it. And we didn't do much with terracing until about 1985 when USDA mandated more conservation work, but we did some. In that meantime, we changed from plowing to disking and bee-blading, so we kept, a higher percent of our residue on top of the ground. I got to see the change from plowing to that type of tillage, and then on to, in 1976, a brother of mine and I bought a planter that we would hope would be a successful no-till planter. Well, it didn't really work out very good because we didn't have the chemicals to make it work out. Yeah. But in 1973, I did buy a planter that would work well with no-till, and since 1973, we've been totally no-till.
1993.
Or 1993. Yeah. I'm getting my dates mixed up. 1976 was the first plant. 1993 was a planter that really worked. And so in the late 90s, we started no-tilling wheat, and by 2008, we were 100% no-till on everything except a little bit of irrigated ground that we just didn't have the equipment to farm other than by doing some tillage. So, yeah, and now we're using some cover crops, and we're in the learning stage about that. I think there's a lot to be learned yet about cover crops, but they do have some potential if we get the rain to make them work.
Yeah. By the sound of it, Marsha, the two of you are more than willing to try new things, new ideas, and stay as much on the cutting edge of what's going on in farming and farm activity as you can.
Yeah, I think we are, and when you've got boys that can handle all that technology, it's a learning curve, but it kind of encourages you and pushes you to try new things and do those different practices.
Keith and Marsha Doane of Osborne County. Tomorrow we'll feature two more of the Kansas Master Farm Homemaker couples in this new class, Howard and Lori Elliott of Brown County and John and Sharon Hendricks of Cheyenne County. This is Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here, and on to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, with a few days behind us now to assess damages from Hurricane Ida, it's become clear that there will be lost productivity for the grain elevators on the lower Mississippi River that account for roughly 61% of soybean exports and 68% of corn exports. The Senior Vice President of Global Grain Marketing for CHS, John Griffith, told DTN that the cooperative's 6.4 million bushel capacity grain terminal at Myrtle Grove, Louisiana, had no structural damage, and crews were expected to begin cleanup there. Now, the executive director of the Soil Transportation Council, Mike Steenhoek, said that the recovery time for infrastructure damage will be critical to follow once power is reestablished in most places. As far as obvious damage and repair needs, Steenhoek pointed to the Cargill grain terminal near Reserve, Louisiana. That facility has 6 million bushels of capacity, also capable of loading 2 ships at the same time, but that facility did have damage to its conveyor system. And ADM's Media Relations Office stated that the company had reached the majority of its employees affected by the hurricane, but was still working to contact a handful of employees since there are continued issues with cell service in some areas. ADM has completed some initial assessments on its 4 grain elevators in that region. The number of days it takes for the grain industry to get facilities back up will be days of lost productivity that have to be made up over time, according to CHS's Griffith. He says all of this comes as southern producers continue harvest, and farmers further north on the Mississippi and its tributaries will begin harvest as well. Some business will be moving to the Pacific Northwest. The ports in Texas were also not affected by that storm. There are options, such as looking at ports along the East Coast for grain movement as well. Griffiths said the industry is pretty efficient at optimizing capacity and mitigating some of the impacts. Still, the Mississippi River ports are responsible for roughly 300,000 metric tons of grain exports per day, but Griffiths says for the core of the grain, corn, and soybean harvest, the port range should be back up and operational. Farmers are taking in more cash than last year, but also paying out more for production inputs, according to the USDA. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Farmers this year will take in 18% more in cash receipts than they did in 2020 at $421.5 billion. Net cash income could grow by 21.5%. That growth might have been even larger, but farmers have been seeing a substantial hike in production expenses. In fact,
there are very few things where production expenses are actually lower in 2021.
USDA's chief economist Seth Meyer told us
it's basically production expenses across the board, things like feed and livestock purchases. But when you really look at it, most things we've seen an increase, and that includes things like interest expenses, labor expenses, rent, fertilizer, seeds, fuels, and oils.
The only major production items expected to end up costing less this year are pesticides. USDA forecasting overall farm production costs to top last year by over 7%. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Next up, this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning bird control on your farms. As we head into fall, many of you probably have already started to notice there's a few more birds around the farm. For our dairies, that's a major concern. As we go into fall and we start to see the starlings bunch up on our dairies, we really need to think about what this impact this is having on our dairies. As you might notice, and you see a few birds, and then all of a sudden you have a whole lot of birds on your farms. And this is really typical bird behavior, so there'll be a few birds that show up. They're sometimes what we call sentinel birds. What they're doing is they're just checking out your dairy. Is it a good place to feed? Is it a good place to roost? If they determine that it's a good place, they'll bring their friends, and sometimes those friends come in the thousands. So this can have a major effect upon your dairy farm. So one of the things you might want to think about is that if these birds are feeding, a starling can consume about a penny's worth of feed every day. So if you have 10,000 birds on the farm, that's about $100 a day. And I would submit that sometimes when we have heavy bird infestations, that we sometimes see tens of thousands of birds. So it's 3, 4, 5, 6 times this amount. So it does add up over time. Another thing you need to consider that as the birds feed, they also deposit manure onto the feed. That manure likely is going to contain some E. coli and salmonella and some other organisms that are not beneficial to your animals. Also, there'll be some ammonia in that as well. So feed intake on your animals may be impacted because of what's being deposited, and then we may have some outbreaks of health issues as a result of that as well. So what do you need to do? Well, number one, you need to determine whether or not the birds are feeding on your farm or roosting on your farm. In some cases, they may be doing both. In the case of starlings, they're showing up mid-morning and then leaving by late afternoon. They're just only feeding. If they're showing up in the evening and just staying all night roosting, that's a different control method that we need to look at. So, how do we control the birds on our dairies? Well, there's a couple things to consider. Number one, the first thing we try to do is just disturb the birds and chase them away. You have to be consistent with that. Generally, it's going to take about 7 to 10 days of diligent work, whether they're feeding or whether they're roosting, to scare them away and keep them away. So every day you have to go out and do it. If they're feeding, it's going to have to be during the daylight hours. If they're coming in and roosting at night, you're going to have to use those tactics for about an hour right before dark until it gets dark. But you've got to keep them pushed away from all of the buildings. So if you're on a farm that has multiple buildings, this is the challenge because they'll just move from barn to barn. You have to follow them, keep harassing them to keep them actually away. You actually have to drive the birds away. If you cannot do that, there's some other options you can look at. One of the best ways is exclusion, actually, and that's putting up netting. And in some of our new designs, we actually design buildings that are actually bird-proof so that they cannot get in the barn anyway. That's one option that we can use on new facilities, not necessarily applicable on many of our older facilities. There's also some poisons that we could use in severe cases. If you need to use those, you'll need to contact the people that control that and see if that can happen on your farm. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take diligence on bird control early to prevent large buildup of birds on your dairy farm.
Thanks, Mike, and we'll return shortly here on Agriculture Today. Coming your way now on this Agriculture Today, another visit with former wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. Charlie, we've had the opportunity several times in the past to take up the impact of wind turbines on flying wildlife, and this is another aspect of this we'll talk about today, but this has been a highlighted problem, has it not?
It certainly has, and Kansas has lots of potential for additional wind power. Even now, wind power generates over 41% of the state's electricity. Wind power has increased in Kansas sixfold since 2009. U.S.-wide, wind power has tripled in the last decade. There certainly appears to be potential with appropriate mitigation in the state to perhaps double or triple it again. Some estimates say that there's half of the state that could be suitable for wind power. There are some hoops to go through, as there is with many federally funded projects, and that is, what are those impacts on wildlife? We know that there have been bird and bat fatalities caused by collisions with wind turbine blades. Some of those estimates would include more than 600,000 to 800,000 bats being killed, and 200,000 to 400,000 small birds, or over 500,000 of birds of all different sizes. So because installed wind energy capacity in the United States has doubled, we expect that those bird and bat fatalities, which were estimated in the early 2000s, have also greatly increased. So there's some things that you can do to reduce some of those fatalities. Careful siting for the wind farms is certainly important, but then also micro siting where you're putting those turbines within a project based on specific flight behavior patterns can reduce fatality rates. But really the only effective fatality reduction measure has been to curtail the operation for a period of time. And that's been documented for bats, but not for birds.
There's a new study, though, you say, that gets into that in some depth, and that is what happens when the operation of a wind turbine is curtailed for a prescribed period of time.
Yes, this was 3 separate studies that was done in California where most of the wind power and wildlife fatality projects have been done. It is also one of the sites of one of the largest wind farms. So the studies were basically with three separate objectives. They used scent detection dogs and short search intervals so that they can do a better job of documenting the fatalities. There's always been a problem of finding fatalities, and that meant if you don't find any, that doesn't mean there weren't any. Perhaps your search wasn't intense enough. So they have determined with the use of scent detection dogs and shorter search intervals, perhaps as short as 5 days, they can do a better job of documenting fatalities. So they use scent detection dogs, and then one other study used human searchers, averaging 5-day intervals between searches. And the objective was to test whether wind turbine curtailment and then conversion of wind turbines from inoperable to operable affected fatality rates of birds and bats. And then the second objective was to test whether wind turbine curtailment affected nocturnal bird and bat passage rates through those wind turbine rotors, where they measured passage rates as the hourly number of subjects that passed through or within 1 meter of the rotors.
And when this all shook out, you say that there was a distinction between the impacts on birds and bats.
Well, in the first study, wind turbine curtailment significantly reduced near misses and rotor-disrupted flights of bats, and it significantly reduced fatalities of bats, but not of birds. In the second study, when you converted wind turbines from inoperable to operable status, that did not significantly increase bird fatalities, and bird species of whole or sheltered ledge nesters, which would be those birds that would find places to roost on those towers, died in substantial numbers at vacant towers. The bird species that were represented by the fatalities in that study, most of those, 79% of those birds, were found near inoperable towers because of their suitability as roost sites. The third project did not provide significant results.
With those findings in hand, then, what's been learned about operating turbines or establishing turbines, for that matter?
Well, I think we've always known that it's going to have to be a compromise between power generation and wildlife loss. It's probably not feasible to put up wind power in facilities that have high numbers of wildlife and that are in sites where wildlife and turbines are going to come into conflict. But wildlife is not evenly distributed across the landscape, so siting is certainly an important part, and wildlife professionals should be involved early on in the siting of where these facilities are going to be placed. We know that the bird migration season is relatively short, and it corresponds with reduced wind speeds, and so perhaps a seasonal curtailment of shutting those down would greatly reduce bat fatalities without giving up a large portion of a project's annual energy generation. Now, the cost effectiveness of that would improve if you could narrow that migration season down somewhat, and that seems to be that first hour following dusk. So perhaps designing those wind farms to be shut down in a shorter period of time can be an adequate compromise. They also suggest design these turbines without accessible interior spaces so birds don't have places to roost when they are inoperable. And I think we're going to have some compromises. Those seem like some things that might be acceptable, but I think it still needs to be studied in a broader context than just in California. The bird species that were killed there, the highest number were rock pigeons, mourning doves, burrowing owls, European starlings, western meadowlark. Of those, the burrowing owl seems to be one that perhaps should be looked at much closer.
Well, as you described, with the continuing growth of wind energy, the interaction between wildlife, specifically birds and bats in this case, and the operation of those wind turbines deserves continual study. And Charlie, thanks. Charlie Lee, former K-State Research and Extension Wildlife Specialist. Our time's away once more. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.